So I'm going to talk about fear and compassion because I have a sense that fear can get in the way of our being truly compassionate, and there's a lot of fear around at the moment. And it's understandable, but it's also sad because I think we are naturally compassionate as beings. Well, is this what helps? It's to find a way of living life so that in each moment we can touch the gift of every fresh experience. For no circumstance is exactly the same as any previous circumstance. We can know this when we're totally conscious at any moment, and then living thus, without anticipation of what is to come, no attachment to what has already passed, and no clinging to what is there in the moment. And this is quite a tall order, but we can do that. I was just reminded when something Reverend Master Daishin wrote in that recent article of his on loneliness, when he said, direct experience is not serial. It is the whole that is experienced all together and at once. So I guess I'm suggesting that beneath attachment and resistance lurks fear, and these emotions create a barrier across which our compassion struggles to be seen. And I quite like this saying, which is attributed to a sage of ancient China, Chuang Tzu, and he says, little fears cause anxiety, big fears cause panic. So let's consider three different manifestations of fear. Fear of pain, fear of being vulnerable and exposed, and fear of death. Let's just take that simple thing of sitting in sesshin, which you've all done many times. And there's sure to be some physical discomfort. I think somehow familiar tensions and knots begin to be felt more and more. And they may be due to an underlying physical condition, which can be exacerbated by spiritual blockages. So I guess we all try to release those sorts of tensions because we have learnt the lesson that the more we concentrate on them and worry about them, then the tenser we get, and the whole thing spirals off. So what if each of us can find a way of accepting the pain? Then what happens? If you're willing to be uncomfortable, well, you have at the same time absolutely to stay responsible for what is unwise to put your body through. But if you're willing to keep responsible and try and stay with the pain, then you won't do any long-term damage to your body. And I'm afraid it's up to each of us not to damage our body by striving on. And I think that can be quite a temptation for some monks to be very determinedly ascetic about it. I'm just not going to give in to this. And that really isn't wise. Because striving on heroically, you can learn to really regret that in years to come. It is rather foolish. So what of the fear of being vulnerable and exposed? Don't all of us, to some degree, fear other people's judgment of us? Sort of, people won't like me, they wouldn't respect me if they knew me as well as I know myself. But just hang on a moment. That is quite a foolish thought. Partly because we think we are successfully playing a role as a confident, self-assured, got it all together human being. But actually it's very unlikely that others don't see through this. There's a lot about masks at the moment, but it's like wearing a mask that's already slipped off without us noticing. I'm sure we all are more transparent to others than we may care to acknowledge. Another, I find, cringe-making aspect is having to recognize that it's our judgmentalism in relation to others and how they behave that reveals so much about us. If we so fear others' judgment, isn't it in part because we are judging them and so assume they are judging us? And then the big one, fear of death. And at this time of the pandemic, taking many lives, we are forced to face that nothing is solid, static, steady. Looking penetratingly at ourselves, we see that mind-body has always been a constant flux of creation and dissolution. And of course, that creation and dissolution applies to all conditions. Yet, let's take heart with the constant flux of the world situation, now so starkly apparent, allows a chance for us to become one with birth and death. Life and death are integral to the whole. They are together and alone, utterly indivisible. There is a totality. Life seems so fragile, but it always has been. Life, eternal, we talk about sometimes in Buddhism. But it's more complicated than that. Life, is it really eternal? Is death really oblivion? And these sort of questions, I guess, if they come up for you as well as me, only we can find the answer for ourselves. And I'm very intrigued by what Ramos has been saying recently. Actually, each of us has to find our own way, but not a kind of grandiose, I'll do things my way. But, we can't rely on others' training to see us through. It has to be our own that does. And acknowledging the universality of this primordial desire to exist may be helpful. And can you see that such a desire is not really the same as clinging to life, which is certainly a source of suffering? It leads us to ask, or leads me to ask, why am I here? In spite of the sense that there will never be an unchanging answer to this question, we still feel compelled to go on asking it. There is always the unknown, always the great mystery. Our thinking minds continue to try to figure this out, and that's not bad. But I think we need to realize that there is something that we're never going to be figure out in the sort of way that we can then explain to ourselves and others what it's all about. And, we perhaps argue, at least with ourselves, that, we can understand causes and conditions. That's karma to a certain extent. But in the end, do we not have to realize that there will always remain the great mystery? Why are we here? We go on, though, hoping that there will be a clear explanation of human life, a clear explanation for everything, a remedy for all humanity's problems, especially mortality. it seems very difficult to bring oneself to agreeing to the truth of the universe having no beginning and no end. I don't know why, perhaps because we're afraid of what that might imply. Might it be that there is a desire that wants to exist? There is a force. But is that external force, that desire sacred or impure? Born out of sacredness, not original sin. We don't do original sin in Buddhism. And the Buddha taught that there are three cravings: craving for existence, craving for sensual pleasure, and craving for non-existence. Any craving is neurotic and usually accompanied by lots of fear and insecurity. Yet, I was going to say I believe, but in a sense I kind of know it for myself, that we can find a place within suffering where there is no craving, where we are free. And many find at the moment of death that they are able to cut through fear and die at peace, totally accepting non-existence. The Buddha taught that we must inquire in order to understand the root of suffering. He did not speak of transcending suffering. Rather, he spoke of utter acceptance of suffering, and thus cutting it off at its root. If we can do that, we realize that our mind is intrinsically spacious, intrinsically free. Yet we continue to get caught up in desires and aversions. It's only human. And so we continue to practice, to know for sure that liberation is possible, is real. It helps a heck of a lot to let go of trying to be perfect. This leads down a dark cul-de-sac, despair, where we can never be perfect enough. Well, entertain the thought that we are already perfect, and yet at the same time fallible human beings. So why not take the route of forgiving yourself for being human, rather than a saint, and continue to do the very best you can? I'm not saying take fears lightly, for when we delve into them, they have much to offer. Respect them, for they go very deep. Jump into whatever is. See that this is. What is it at this very moment, at each and every moment? And possibly teach yourself not to act out of every fear, or this could become a fixation of the mind. Rather aim to learn from experience fear, for fear is a great teacher. I think keeping a sense of humour helps. As someone commented recently, pretending by playing out the various roles I have constructed for myself, sometimes it's funny and I can laugh at myself. When you can't laugh at yourself, at least remind yourself that grimness isn't awareness, it's just grimness. And this time of coronavirus is also making us ponder on what the new normal will be. Many will be destitute and struggle to make a living. We may become socially more isolated, even with the help of technology, to keep us in contact. gaps will appear. Our old reality will be lost and no longer available, and we may have little sense of what the new reality will be. This can make us feel as if there's no ground to rest on, no certainty, no reference points. How can we then rest peacefully? Can we find contentment in a new world, a new way of living and relating? Milarepa said something helpful, or at least helpful to me. The precious pot containing my riches becomes my teacher in the moment it breaks. Does it feel as if your precious pot has broken? So I'm asking, can you allow yourselves to take on board how conditional our sense of who I amness really is? That it never was the utterly reliable ground we imagined on which to stand. There was no ideal self after all. And if we imagined there was, such imaginings were somewhat ludicrous and now totally irrelevant. The precious pot has broken. Just now to move on to compassion. Just as a fish cannot live without water, compassion cannot develop without egolessness, and without egolessness there is no experience of emptiness, shunyata. It might be that at this present moment, when the suffering of others is impossible to ignore, we find compassion, the openness of our hearts to others' pain, unbearable, and we try to turn away. Yet we find there's no one, nowhere to turn away to. Suffering is universal. Be still, and you may find that you are able to bear the world's pain. And this includes your own pain, of course. You can be a witness to the world's pain. I read something about Pema Chodron recently. Compassion is threatening to the ego. We might like to think of it as something warm and soothing, but actually it is very raw. When we set out to support other beings, when we go so far as to stand in their shoes, when we aspire never to close down to anyone, we quickly find ourselves in the uncomfortable territory of life not on my terms. So go step by step, transforming your thoughts and behavior on a daily basis. First, be open enough to allow awareness of mistakes, of unkind action, of unkind thoughts, and with an awareness that does not have to have the added on of judgment. You will find it more possible not to follow the desire to cut off compassion, rather to ground yourself in the uncomfortable territory of life not on my terms. So I suggest we are aiming to cultivate compassion without attachment. It can help if you think of compassion for another as a wish for them to be free of suffering. The Dalai Lama makes a distinction between compassion and love. For instance, as a parent was one of a couple Your love can be so coloured by your own emotional needs that really it's not compassionate. Compassion is free from a love based on projections and expectations. Love, love that in a relationship that goes on for many years, it can still be a sort of trading relationship. I will love you if ... There's a kind of, you have to play your part in loving me, or offering to me. Yet compassion without attachment is a real possibility. But we do need to see where it is distinct from love. Compassion does not change with others' behavior, whereas love is often conditional on our needs being met. Compassion is distinguished by being based on the need of other, whether enemy or close friend is irrelevant.